Before I tell you what happened, I want you to imagine something. Imagine trusting two people more than anyone in the world. Imagine putting your faith in them, believing they would never hurt you because how could they? They're family, blood and vows, right? Now imagine finding out they've been stabbing you in the back for months, smiling in your face like nothing's wrong. That's my story. A story of betrayal so deep, I'm still trying to claw my way out of it. And I wish I could tell you it all unraveled with a clear sign, a big red flag I could have caught. But no. It started with something as innocent as a text message. Let me take you back. It was a quiet Friday evening in March. One of those rare, perfect nights where everything feels just right. My wife, Sarah, was in the kitchen making spaghetti, humming along to some indie playlist. I'd always loved that about her, how she could lose herself in the music, cooking with the kind of ease I could never master. "Dinner's almost ready," she called out, poking her head into the living room. I smiled, sitting on the couch, halfway through a bottle of beer. "Smells good," I replied. At the time, I meant it. Everything smelled good. Everything felt good. Then my phone buzzed. I grabbed it off the coffee table without thinking. I figured it was a buddy texting about the game later that weekend. But when I looked at the screen, I froze. It was a message from my brother, Chris. "We're still good for tonight? She thinks you don't suspect anything." I stared at the words, the beer suddenly tasting bitter in my mouth. My brain short-circuited for a second. What the hell was that supposed to mean? I unlocked my phone, my hands already clammy, and reread the message. It was definitely from Chris. My younger brother, my best friend, the guy who'd always been at my side. And I wasn't stupid. I knew what she meant. "Sarah." I sat there on the couch, my mind racing. At first, I told myself it had to be a mistake. Maybe Chris meant to text someone else? Or maybe I was just misunderstanding. That's what we do, right? We rationalize. We try to protect ourselves from the worst-case scenario. But something about the words, "She thinks you don't suspect anything," lodged themselves in my chest like a bullet. "Everything okay?" Sarah's voice startled me. I looked up, and there she was, smiling at me from the doorway. She wiped her hands on a kitchen towel, her eyes warm and normal, like nothing was wrong. I forced a smile. "Yeah, work stuff." It was the first lie I'd ever told her. Sarah nodded, satisfied with my answer, and went back into the kitchen. But as soon as she turned around, her humming started again, and it made my skin crawl. My pulse pounded in my ears as I stared at the phone. I wanted to reply to Chris, "What the hell are you talking about?" But I didn't. Not yet. Instead, I decided to do something I'd never done in our 6 years of marriage. I checked Sarah's phone. Her phone was charging on the kitchen counter. I got up slowly, my heart hammering in my chest, and peeked into the kitchen. Sarah's back was turned as she stirred the sauce, earbuds in her ears. She didn't notice me. I grabbed her phone and slipped back into the living room, unlocking it with the passcode I knew by heart. The first thing I checked was her messages. Nothing suspicious, just chats with friends, coworkers, me. I was about to put the phone down, ashamed of myself, when I noticed something. There was a message thread that had been deleted. Not a single text remained, but it was still there. A blank conversation with my brother, Chris. I nearly dropped the phone. Why the hell would Sarah delete her messages with my brother? The room felt like it was closing in on me. My mind was running a mile a minute, cycling through every moment we'd spent together over the past few months. Chris had been around a lot lately, more than usual. Sunday barbecues, game nights, the way Sarah would light up when he cracked one of his stupid jokes. I'd laughed it off, never once questioning it. Why would I? Chris was family. Sarah was my wife. I shoved her phone back on the counter before she could notice it was gone. I didn't say a word about the text or the empty message thread during dinner. Couldn't. My appetite was gone, replaced by this awful, twisting feeling in my gut. That night, I lay awake next to Sarah, staring at the ceiling while she slept peacefully beside me. I kept hearing Chris's words in my head. "She thinks you don't suspect anything." I knew I wasn't crazy. Something was going on, and I was going to find out what. The next morning, I woke up before Sarah. I hadn't slept more than an hour, my mind running circles around the same thoughts. That message from Chris. The empty thread on her phone. The why of it all consumed me. Why him? Why now? And most of all, how long? Sarah rolled over as I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor. "Morning," she murmured, her voice soft and sleepy. I glanced back at her, forcing a smile that felt foreign on my face. "Morning." She sat up, stretching, completely oblivious to the storm brewing in my head. "You okay? You look off." "Just didn't sleep well," I muttered. It wasn't a lie, but I couldn't meet her eyes. The woman I had loved for years, the woman I trusted, was now the same person I couldn't look at without feeling sick. She leaned over, pressing a kiss to my shoulder. Felt wrong. Her hands, her lips, everything about her felt wrong now. "I'll make coffee," she said, slipping out of bed and heading to the kitchen. I let out a shaky breath once I was alone and grabbed my phone off the nightstand. Chris's message from last night was still there, like a wound that refused to heal. I couldn't ignore it anymore. What was that text about last night? I hit send and stared at the screen, waiting. 5 minutes passed. 10. No reply. I got dressed slowly, my hands still shaking. Couldn't let this go. I needed answers. Sarah was sitting at the kitchen table when I walked in, 2 mugs of coffee in front of her. She looked up and smiled as if nothing had changed. "You're off today, right?" she asked. I nodded, picking up the coffee. "Yeah. Good. Maybe we can go out later. A movie? Dinner?" Her words felt rehearsed. I didn't know if it was my paranoia or if I was finally seeing cracks in the mask she wore so perfectly. "I'll think about it," I replied, trying to sound neutral. Her smile faltered for a second. Just a second. Then she picked up her phone and started scrolling through it like I wasn't even there. I watched her, wondering if she was texting him. "Chris, my brother." The thought made me grip the mug so hard I thought it would shatter. After a few minutes, I grabbed my keys. "I'm heading out for a bit." Sarah looked up, surprised. "Where are you going?" I shrugged. "Just need some air." She stared at me for a moment, her smile more forced this time. "Okay, don't be gone too long." I got in my car and drove aimlessly for a while, trying to clear my head. But no matter where I went, Chris's words haunted me. "She thinks you don't suspect anything." Finally, I pulled into the driveway of my parents' house. Chris still lived here, temporarily, he claimed. My parents were traveling, so I knew he'd be alone. I slammed the car door and walked up to the house. My fists were already clenched. I didn't know what I was going to say, but I couldn't keep this in anymore. The door was unlocked, like it always was. I stepped inside, and the sound of video game gunfire greeted me. I followed it into the living room. There he was, Chris, sitting on the couch in sweatpants, controller in hand, looking like he didn't have a care in the world. "Hey man," he said, glancing up with a grin. "What's up?" I didn't smile back. I didn't even sit down. "What was that text?" The grin faded off his face, replaced by confusion. "What? Don't play dumb, Chris," I said, my voice sharp. I pulled out my phone and held it up, the message glaring back at him. "You texted me last night by accident. She thinks you don't suspect anything." "Who were you talking about?" Chris froze. His controller fell onto the floor with a clatter. He stared at me, his face pale. "Jason," he started, but I didn't let him finish. "Who were you talking about?" I repeated, my voice shaking with anger. Chris rubbed his hands over his face, groaning like he was trying to figure out what to say. "Listen, man. It's not what you think. Don't lie to me." I exploded. "Not after that text. Tell me the truth, Chris. Tell me what's going on with Sarah." His eyes widened, and I could see the guilt written all over his face. He didn't deny it. Not once. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. "You son of a bitch," I whispered, my voice shaking. "You've been sleeping with her, haven't you?" Chris stood up, his hands held out like he was trying to calm me down. "Jason, listen. Don't," I snarled, taking a step toward him. "How long, Chris? How long have you been screwing my wife? He didn't answer. He just stood there, staring at me like he didn't recognize me anymore. The silence was all the answer I needed. I turned and stormed toward the door. Jason, wait! Chris called after me, but I ignored him. I climbed into my car and gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. My whole body was trembling. My own brother. My wife. I felt like a complete idiot. I should have seen the signs. I should have known. But I wasn't done yet. As I sat there, staring at my phone, a new thought hit me. If Chris had sent that message to me by accident, then he'd meant to send it to Sarah. And that meant she was probably expecting to hear from him. I swiped through my contacts, my finger hovering over Sarah's name. My mind raced. I needed to be smart about this. I needed to catch her in the act. Both of them. I took a deep breath and sent her a text. Hey babe, something came up. I'll be gone for a while. Don't wait up. The dots appeared almost immediately. Sarah. Okay. Be safe. Love you, red heart. The fake affection made me want to throw my phone out the window. Let's see how this plays out, I thought. If I was right, and I prayed I wasn't, then my wife and my brother would use this time to see each other. And I was going to catch them. I put the car in gear and drove off, my heart pounding in my chest. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. I didn't know how long I'd been driving. My knuckles were white on the steering wheel. My jaw locked so tightly I thought I'd break a tooth. Every thought in my head was a dark, chaotic swirl. My wife, Sarah. The woman I'd vowed to love forever. My brother, Chris, my own blood. Together, sneaking around behind my back. The betrayal cut deeper because I'd trusted them both. If you can't trust your family, who can you trust? As I drove, I kept replaying that damn text in my mind. She thinks you don't suspect anything. They must have laughed about it, about me. That made my blood boil all over again. I pulled into the parking lot of an old diner a few miles away and killed the engine. I needed a plan. Storming back to the apartment like some lunatic wouldn't get me anywhere. I needed proof. Cold, hard proof. I needed to see it with my own eyes. So I sat there, my breath fogging up the windshield, trying to think. After a few minutes, I grabbed my phone and opened Sarah's messages. I had no shame about checking her texts now. Hell, she'd forfeited her right to privacy the second she brought my brother into our marriage. But something caught my eye. Her texts with me were as normal as ever, loving, casual, like she hadn't been hiding the ultimate betrayal. But I noticed she had barely texted anyone else. Her friend Emily, her sister, and a few coworkers. That was it. And then it hit me. If they'd been careful enough to delete messages, maybe they weren't texting much at all. Maybe they were using something else. Snapchat. I opened my Snapchat app and checked Sarah's profile. It wasn't unusual for us to send each other dumb videos or pictures now and then, but I noticed something odd right away. She had a Snapchat score that was way higher than the last time I checked. I swallowed hard. Who the hell was she snapping that much? It sure wasn't me. Suddenly, I had an idea. I remembered that Chris always had his Snapchat location turned on. He never cared about privacy. He thought it was fun for people to know where he was. Idiot. I opened the Snap map and zoomed in. Sure enough, there he was. A little bit away from my parents' house, his Bitmoji parked in a neighborhood across town. My heart sank as I stared at the screen. I knew that neighborhood. Sarah and I had been there before. There was a hotel. It wasn't a fancy one. Just a quiet, cheap place that people stayed in when they didn't want to be seen. I squeezed the phone in my hand so tightly I thought I might crack it. My breathing was heavy, my chest heaving with anger. I had them. I parked my car across the street from the hotel, my hands shaking as I cut the engine. The parking lot wasn't busy. Just a few scattered cars under the dim glow of the overhead lights. My eyes scanned the rows until I saw it. Sarah's car. It was parked all the way at the back, half hidden in the shadows. I felt a sharp pain in my chest. Seeing it there made it real. All the denial I'd been clinging to, all the excuses I'd made for her and Chris, they shattered like glass. I sat there in my car, gripping the steering wheel, my breath shallow. I'd always wondered what I'd do if I ever caught someone cheating. Would I explode? Would I crumble? But the truth is, when it happens to you, when you're standing on the edge of a betrayal like this, it's not like the movies. It's quiet. It's cold. And it changes you. I grabbed my phone and opened the camera app. If I was going to confront them, I needed proof. Not for anyone else, for me. So that when they inevitably started spinning their lies, I'd have the truth to hold on to. I stepped out of the car and crossed the street, my shoes crunching on the gravel. The cold night air bit at my skin, but I barely noticed it. My focus was locked on that hotel. As I approached, I noticed a side entrance. I slipped in quietly, avoiding the main lobby. I wasn't exactly sure what I was doing, but I was running on pure instinct at this point. The hallways were eerily quiet. I could hear the hum of a vending machine and the occasional muffled sound of a TV behind one of the doors. I kept walking until I saw it. Sarah's voice. It was faint, coming from one of the rooms at the end of the hallway. I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't hear what she was saying, but I recognized the sound of her laugh. It was light and soft, the kind of laugh I hadn't heard in months. I felt like throwing up. I crept closer, my footsteps silent on the carpeted floor. Room 214. That's where the sound was coming from. I stood there, inches from the door, listening. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped my phone. Then I heard him. Chris, my brother. His voice was unmistakable. Loud. Cocky. So damn familiar it made me sick. "Come on, babe," he said, his tone playful. "You worry too much. He'll never find out." I nearly kicked the door down right then and there. My vision blurred with rage. My chest so tight I could barely breathe. But I stopped myself. I wanted to hear more. I needed to know everything. Sarah's voice came next, softer this time. "I know, but it feels wrong. He's been so good to me, Chris. He doesn't deserve this." Chris laughed. "Yeah, well, life's not fair, is it? Besides, you don't seem to mind it when you're here with me." I clenched my teeth so hard my jaw ached. I wanted to scream, to burst in and wipe that smug grin off his face. But I didn't. Instead, I reached into my pocket and grabbed my phone. My hands were trembling as I pulled up the camera app and hit record. I held the phone close to the door, capturing their voices through the thin wood. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Enough for me to have proof. Chris's voice floated through the door again. "Come here. I've missed you." Sarah giggled, the kind of laugh that used to be mine. The kind of laugh I'd loved hearing on Sunday mornings when we lay in bed, happy and lazy. I couldn't listen anymore. My heart was breaking and burning all at once. I stepped back, still recording, and took a shaky breath. My fingers hovered over the keypad as I dialed Chris's number. Inside the room, I heard his phone buzz. The talking stopped. My heart raced as I listened to the silence stretch out. Then I heard Chris mutter, "Shit." I hit end call and stuffed my phone in my pocket. I'd given myself away, but I didn't care anymore. I was done playing games. I turned and walked back down the hallway, my fists clenched at my sides. I could hear the sound of the door unlocking behind me, but I didn't stop. "Jason!" Chris's voice rang out, echoing through the hall. "Wait!" I kept walking, my body vibrating with anger. "Jason!" Sarah's voice this time, panicked, desperate. "Please, just wait." I spun around so fast they both froze mid-step. Chris stood there shirtless, his face pale as a sheet. Sarah was behind him, wearing one of those hotel robes, her hair a mess. I pulled my phone out of my pocket and held it up. "I know everything," I said, my voice low and dangerous. "Everything." Sarah's face crumpled, tears spilling from her eyes. "Jason, please. You don't get to talk," I snapped, pointing a shaking finger at her. "Neither of you gets to say another damn word." Chris opened his mouth to speak, but I didn't give him the chance. I turned my back on them and walked out of that hotel, leaving them standing there in their shame. I had what I needed now, the truth, and it was only the beginning. I didn't look back as I walked out of that hotel. My footsteps echoed in the empty hallway, every step dragging me further away from the people I thought I knew. My hands were shaking. My chest felt like it was caving in, but I forced myself to keep moving. Outside, The cold air hit me like a slap. I hadn't realized how hard I was breathing until I stood still in the parking lot, staring blankly at Sarah's car parked under the flickering street lamp. I gripped my phone so tightly it hurt, the recording still glowing on the screen. I'd captured their voices, their guilt, their betrayal. It was undeniable now. But here's the thing about betrayal, it doesn't hit you all at once. It comes in waves. The first wave had knocked me over, but I could already feel the next one building, the reality of what I'd just seen and heard starting to sink in. I climbed into my car and slammed the door shut, locking myself in the only place that still felt mine. My phone buzzed in my pocket almost immediately, but I ignored it. I didn't need to see their names. I knew who it was. Chris, Sarah. I couldn't face either of them right now. Instead, I sat there in the dark, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. My mind was a whirlpool, replaying every moment of the last few months. Every smile Sarah had given me, every joke Chris had cracked at my expense. All the Sunday dinners, the family barbecues, the nights Sarah told me she was working late. It was all a lie. I let out a shaky breath and rested my forehead against the steering wheel. I felt like I was drowning, but I couldn't let myself sink. Not yet. After a minute, I picked up my phone and scrolled through my contacts. There was only one person I could think of to call. My mom. She answered on the second ring. Jason? It's late. Is everything okay? Her voice was soft, concerned, and it almost broke me. I swallowed hard, forcing the words out. Mom, where are you? At the cabin, she said immediately. Your dad and I just got here yesterday. Why? What's wrong? I hesitated. I didn't want to drag her into this yet. My parents were good people, and they'd always loved Chris like he was their golden child. Telling them the truth would crush them. I'll explain later, I muttered. I need a place to crash for a few days. I'll head up there tonight. She didn't ask questions. That's the kind of mom she was. Of course, honey. Drive safe. Okay? I'll leave the light on for you. Thanks, Mom, I said, my voice breaking slightly. I hung up and tossed my phone onto the passenger seat. I needed to get out of town, to put some space between myself and the nightmare I just walked into. But as I pulled out of the parking lot, my phone buzzed again. This time I glanced at the screen. It was Sarah. Sarah, Jason, please come home. We need to talk. I can explain. I barked out a bitter laugh, my vision blurring. Explain? What was there to explain? I'd seen enough to know everything I needed to. I ignored the message and hit the gas, leaving that hotel, and everything I thought I knew, behind me. It was a 3-hour drive to my parents' cabin, and I spent every second of it wrestling with my emotions. Anger, pain, confusion. It all blended together into something dark and heavy, sitting in my chest like a stone. At one point, I screamed at the top of my lungs just to feel something other than the twisting ache in my gut. It didn't help. By the time I pulled up to the cabin, it was nearly 2 a.m. The small porch light was on, just like Mom had promised, and the place looked warm and inviting against the pitch-black forest surrounding it. I climbed out of the car, grabbed my bag, and made my way inside. The cabin smelled like cedar and old memories. Family vacations, fishing trips, and lazy summers spent by the lake. It was a place I'd always associated with peace. I didn't feel peaceful now. Mom was waiting for me in the living room, wrapped in her robe and holding a steaming mug of tea. Her face was lined with concern as she looked me over. Jason, what's going on? You look like you've seen a ghost. I swallowed hard, trying to find the words. It's Sarah and Chris. Her brow furrowed. Chris? What about him? The words caught in my throat, and for a moment, I couldn't say it. I couldn't tell my own mother that one of her sons had betrayed the other so completely. Finally, I forced the truth out. They're having an affair, Mom. I caught them. The mug slipped from her hands and shattered on the floor. She stared at me, wide-eyed, like I just told her the sky was green. What did you just say? You heard me. My voice was hoarse. Chris and Sarah. They've been sneaking around behind my back for months. I saw them tonight. I heard them. Mom's hands flew to her mouth as she sank onto the couch, tears pooling in her eyes. "No," she whispered. "Not Chris. He wouldn't." I let out a bitter laugh. "He did, Mom. He did." The silence that followed was suffocating. Mom sat there, trembling, as she tried to process what I just told her. I didn't blame her. I could barely process it myself. Finally, she looked up at me, her face pale. "Where is he now?" "I don't know," I said flatly. "And I don't care." She nodded slowly, wiping at her tears. "I'll talk to him. He's my son. But this is unforgivable." "I don't want you to talk to him," I snapped. "I don't want you to fix this, Mom. I just needed somewhere to go. Somewhere I could breathe." She didn't argue. She just pulled me into a hug, holding me like she used to when I was a kid and I'd scraped my knee. I didn't realize how much I needed it until then. "It's going to be okay, Jason," she whispered. "We'll figure this out." I wanted to believe her, but I couldn't. Not yet. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of my phone buzzing on the nightstand. I groaned, rubbing at my eyes before I grabbed it. 20 missed calls. 14 texts. Most of them were from Sarah. A few were from Chris. I didn't bother reading them, but one message caught my eye. It wasn't from Sarah or Chris. It was from an unknown number. Unknown. "Jason, you don't know me, but you need to hear this. Sarah and Chris aren't telling you everything." I sat up straight, my heart racing. I stared at the screen, trying to process the words. What the hell did that mean? Before I could respond, another message came through. Unknown. "Meet me at Joe's Cafe at noon. I'll explain everything." I felt like the ground had just shifted beneath me. Who was this person? And how did they know about Sarah and Chris? I stared at the message for a long moment before typing back. "Me. Who are you? How do you know about this?" The reply was instant. Unknown. "I'm someone who knows the truth. Trust me. You don't want to ignore this." The unknown message left me rattled. My mind was already a mess, and now this? Someone knew something about Chris and Sarah that I didn't? I stared at the screen, that single line. "Trust me. You don't want to ignore this." Buzzing in my head like a hornet's nest. Part of me wanted to ignore it. How much worse could things get? I'd already seen my wife and my brother betray me. What else could there possibly be? But another part of me, the part that was hungry for answers, knew I couldn't let this go. I stared out the window of the cabin for a long time, watching the early morning sun rise over the lake. My mom was still sleeping in the next room, the shattered pieces of yesterday's news weighing her down. I couldn't drag her further into this, at least not yet. So, I grabbed my keys, slipped out the front door, and drove. The cafe was about an hour away, a little hole-in-the-wall diner I recognized immediately. Sarah and I had eaten here a handful of times, back when we were still happy. I remember she loved their waffles. The memory made me sick. I pulled into the lot a little before noon and sat in my car, scanning the windows. Who the hell had sent me those messages? My palms were clammy on the steering wheel. Then I saw her. She was sitting in a booth near the window, a woman mid-30s with dark blonde hair tied back in a ponytail. She looked nervous, her hands wrapped around a coffee mug. She glanced up and caught me staring. When she saw me, she nodded, as if to say, "I'm the one you're looking for." I took a deep breath, grabbed my phone, and got out of the car. "Jason?" she asked as I approached the table. "Yeah," I said warily, sliding into the booth across from her. "Who are you?" She gave me a faint smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "My name's Rachel. Do I know you?" "No," she shook her head. "But I know you, and I know Sarah, and Chris." At the mention of their names, my stomach twisted. I leaned forward, lowering my voice. "How?" Rachel exhaled, looking down at her coffee. "It's a long story, but before I explain, I need you to promise me something." "What?" "Promise me you won't walk away until you hear me out." I narrowed my eyes, suspicion prickling at the back of my neck. "That depends on what you're about to tell me." She looked up, meeting my gaze. "You think Sarah and Chris's affair is the worst part of this, don't you?" I felt a jolt of anger. It's bad enough. Rachel shook her head slowly. Jason, you don't know the half of it. My breath caught. What are you talking about? Rachel hesitated for a moment, like she was trying to figure out where to start. Finally, she said, I used to be married to Chris. Her words hit me like a freight train. I sat back, stunned. Wait, what? She nodded, her expression tight. Yeah, we were married for 5 years. You probably don't remember me because Chris didn't want you to. He kept me far away from his family. Said you were all too judgmental. That doesn't sound like Chris? I muttered, though I wasn't so sure anymore. It does sound like him, Rachel corrected sharply. You just never saw that side of him. Chris is a liar, Jason. A manipulator. He was cheating on me for most of our marriage. And when I finally found out and confronted him, She stopped, biting her lip. He ruined me. Took everything. My savings, my dignity, everything. And then he left. I stared at her, still trying to process what she was telling me. Why are you telling me this? Why now? Rachel leaned forward, her voice low and urgent. Because I've been watching him for a while. After what he did to me, I couldn't just let it go. I needed to know he wouldn't do it to someone else. That's when I found out about Sarah. Hearing Sarah's name made my heart squeeze painfully. You knew about the affair? Rachel nodded. Yeah, I found out a couple of months ago. I saw them together at a hotel, a restaurant, even once in your neighborhood. First, I thought about telling you, but I didn't know how. Then, when I saw you leave your house last night, I figured you'd finally caught on. I ran a hand through my hair, my mind spinning. Jesus Christ. But there's more, Rachel added, her tone serious. That's why I texted you. I looked up at her sharply. What do you mean there's more? Rachel hesitated, like she wasn't sure whether to tell me. But then she pulled her phone out of her pocket and set it on the table in front of me. I've been digging into Chris's life, she said. After what he did to me, I wanted to know everything. And when I started following him, I found something. Something you need to see. I stared at her phone, my heart pounding. What is it? Rachel unlocked the screen and swiped through a few photos before holding it up for me to see. It was a picture. A grainy shot of Chris sitting in a car. But he wasn't alone. There was a woman sitting in the passenger seat, talking to him. I leaned closer, squinting at the screen. My blood turned to ice. It wasn't Sarah. It was a woman I'd never seen before. Who is that? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Rachel's eyes were cold. Her name is Melissa. She's Chris's other girlfriend. I felt like the ground had just been ripped out from under me. Other girlfriend? What the hell are you talking about? Chris is a player, Jason, Rachel said bitterly. Sarah's not the only one he's been fooling around with. He's been seeing Melissa for almost as long as he's been seeing Sarah. I sat back in the booth, stunned. My mind couldn't keep up with what she was telling me. My brother wasn't just having an affair with my wife, he was cheating on her too. But Rachel wasn't finished. And here's the kicker, she said, pulling up a video on her phone. Melissa doesn't know about Sarah. Or you. Or me, for that matter. She pressed play, and Chris's voice filled the quiet cafe. Don't worry, babe, he was saying, his tone sweet and familiar. You're the only one I care about. The rest of it doesn't matter. I stared at the screen, rage boiling inside me. Chris had lied to everyone. He'd played all of us like puppets. And for what? His own amusement? Rachel looked at me, her expression unreadable. I thought you deserved to know. I sat there in stunned silence, staring at the table. My entire life had been torn apart in less than 24 hours. And now this? What are you going to do? Rachel asked quietly. I clenched my fists on the table, my vision blurring with anger. I'm going to end this, I said. All of it. I sat in the car outside the cafe for a long time after Rachel left, staring blankly at the steering wheel as my mind raced. Chris, my brother, my blood. Not only had he betrayed me by sneaking around with my wife, he'd been lying to her too. And to Melissa, this other woman. It was like I was looking at a stranger. I didn't know who Chris really was anymore. He wasn't just a cheater. He wasn't just selfish. He was a full-blown manipulator, stringing along everyone around him like they were nothing more than chess pieces in his stupid little game. And I was done playing along. By the time I got back to town, I had a plan. Petty one. A destructive one. But at that point, I didn't care anymore. I needed Chris and Sarah to feel what I felt, to watch everything they thought they controlled crumble in front of their eyes. I wasn't just going to confront them. I was going to expose them. First, I made a few phone calls. I called Melissa, the woman Rachel had shown me. I wasn't sure what to expect when I dialed the number Rachel had given me, but after 3 rings, she answered. Hello. Her voice was soft, cautious. Is this Melissa? Yeah. Who's this? My name's Jason, I said flatly. You don't know me, but I think we need to talk. It's about Chris. There was a long pause. Then, carefully, what about him? I took a deep breath, steadying myself. He's been lying to you. He's been lying to me. And there's someone else you need to know about. I don't understand, she said, her voice cracking slightly. What are you talking about? He's been seeing my wife, I said, the words bitter in my mouth. For months. I caught them together. And you're not the only one he's been fooling around with. Melissa was silent for so long I thought she'd hung up. But then she said, quietly, where can we meet? The next day, I met Melissa and Rachel at a small diner outside town. I didn't know what I expected when I walked in, but when I saw Melissa sitting there with Rachel, something clicked. Melissa was young, probably mid-20s, with dark hair and a sadness in her eyes that I recognized immediately. The look of someone who'd been lied to so thoroughly they didn't know what to believe anymore. Rachel had already filled her in on most of it. When I sat down, Melissa just stared at me, her face pale. How long have they been? Months, I said simply. At least as far as I know. I only found out a few days ago. Melissa looked down at her hands, her shoulders slumping. He told me I was the only one. He said he loved me. I couldn't help but laugh bitterly. Yeah, well, that's what he does. He lies. Rachel cut in, her voice sharp. We can sit here all day and feel sorry for ourselves, or we can do something about it. Chris has been playing all of us. It's time we turn the tables. I looked at her, surprised. What do you mean? Rachel leaned forward, a small, dangerous smile on her lips. We expose him. All of us. Together. We make sure he can't manipulate or lie his way out of this one. Melissa looked up, her expression uncertain. How? Rachel glanced at me. Jason, you said you recorded him and Sarah, right? I nodded slowly. Yeah. I've got a recording of them talking in the hotel room. I've also got texts, messages, enough to prove everything. Good. Rachel's eyes gleamed with a kind of satisfaction that was almost frightening. We use that. We confront them, but we don't do it alone. We do it where they can't run, where they can't hide. I stared at her, the pieces of her plan starting to fall into place in my head. You mean, in front of everyone? Exactly. Rachel smiled grimly. Family, friends, anyone who thinks Chris is such a great guy. We let them see the truth. You deserve that, Jason. We deserve that. Melissa looked between us, hesitant. I don't know if I can face him. I looked at her, my voice steady. You can. Trust me. After everything he's done, he doesn't deserve your silence. Melissa swallowed hard but nodded. Okay, I'm in. The plan came together quickly. Chris's birthday was that weekend, and my parents were throwing him a big party at their house. Family, friends, everyone who cared about him would be there. It was perfect. I didn't tell my mom or dad what I was planning. I didn't want them to know yet, and honestly, I didn't know how they'd react. Chris had always been the favorite, the golden child. This was going to shatter them. But they deserved to know the truth. Everyone did. On the day of the party, I showed up early. My mom greeted me at the door with a hug, completely oblivious to the storm I was about to bring down on her house. I'm glad you came, she said warmly. Chris will be so happy to see you. I forced a smile. Yeah, can't wait. The house filled up quickly. I watched as people streamed in, cousins, uncles, family friends, all of them there to celebrate Chris. My stomach churned as I saw Sarah arrive, looking beautiful and carefree as always. She smiled at me when she saw me, like nothing was wrong. "Jason," she said softly, pulling me aside. "You didn't come home last night." I was worried. I stared at her, my blood boiling. "You were worried?" I said, my voice low and bitter. "Don't pretend to care, Sarah. Not anymore." Her face fell slightly. "Jason, please. Save it," I snapped. "You'll want to hear this." I turned and walked away before she could say anything else. I spotted Chris across the room, laughing with some of our cousins. He looked so damn smug, like he didn't have a care in the world. Not for long. When everyone was settled, my mom stood up to give a toast. She smiled brightly, holding up her glass. "To my wonderful son, Chris. We're so proud of you, and we love you so much." Everyone clapped, and Chris grinned, soaking up the attention. I felt sick just looking at him. When the applause died down, I stepped forward. "Actually," I said loudly, "I'd like to say something too." The room went quiet. All eyes turned to me. Chris frowned, looking confused. "Jason, what?" I ignored him. My hands were shaking, but my voice was steady as I pulled my phone from my pocket. "I wasn't sure I'd come here today," I said, my voice carrying through the room, "because I've recently learned something about my brother, Chris. Something that changes everything I thought I knew about him." "Jason," Chris said sharply, his face paling. "What the hell are you doing?" I turned to face the crowd. "Chris has been sleeping with my wife." A collective gasp filled the room. My mother dropped her glass, the sound of it shattering on the floor echoing through the silence. Chris's face went white. Sarah, who was standing near the back, covered her mouth with both hands. "Jason, stop!" Chris shouted, stepping toward me. But I wasn't done. I held up my phone. "You want proof? I have it right here. Their voices, their messages, everything." The room erupted into chaos. My mom was crying. My dad looked like someone had punched him in the gut. People were shouting, at me, at Chris, at Sarah. Chris lunged for me, but I stepped back. "You don't get to play the victim here," I snapped. "You did this. You brought this on yourself." He froze, his fists clenched at his sides, his face twisted with rage and shame. Sarah, tears streaming down her face, whispered, "Jason, I'm so sorry." I turned to her, my voice cold. "Sorry doesn't cut it." Then I turned and walked out of the house, leaving them to deal with the wreckage they'd caused. When I walked out of my parents' house that day, the air felt different, like I just dropped a bomb and was standing in the aftermath of the explosion. My heart was pounding, but a strange sense of relief washed over me. For the first time in days, maybe months, I felt like I could breathe again. The truth was finally out. No more lies. No more pretending. I sat in my car, gripping the steering wheel as I listened to the muffled chaos spilling out of the house behind me. I could still hear shouting, my mom's sobs, my dad's booming voice demanding answers. I didn't want to see the fallout. Not yet. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, expecting to see a message from Chris or Sarah, but it wasn't. It was from Melissa. "Melissa, did you do it?" "Me, yeah, it's done." A few seconds later, she replied, "Melissa, good. He had it coming. Are you okay?" I stared at the screen for a moment before typing back, "Me, I don't know yet, but I will be." I tossed the phone onto the passenger seat, turned the engine over, and drove away. I didn't have a destination. I just needed to get the hell out of there. I spent the next few hours driving aimlessly around town. The adrenaline that had been holding me together started to fade, and the exhaustion hit me like a train. I ended up parking at an empty lot overlooking the lake, a place Sarah and I used to go when we were younger, back when things were simple and life still felt good. I sat there for a long time, staring out at the water as the sun dipped below the horizon. My thoughts drifted to Chris, to Sarah, to all the moments they'd stolen from me. I wanted to hate them both, and part of me did, but another part of me just felt hollow. I couldn't help but think about everything I'd lost. My wife, my brother, my trust. It wasn't just betrayal, it was a death. The death of the life I thought I had. My phone buzzed again. This time it was my mom. Mom, Jason, please come home. We need to talk. I sighed, leaning back against the headrest. I knew this was far from over. Chris and Sarah weren't just people I could cut out of my life and forget about. Chris was my brother. My parents would never let this go quietly. But I wasn't ready to face them yet. I needed time. I didn't hear from Chris directly for the next 2 days. I ignored all of Sarah's calls and texts. My parents left me voicemails begging me to come back and talk, but I couldn't do it. Not yet. Then, on the 3rd day, my doorbell rang. I was staying at the cabin alone, trying to sort through the mess of my thoughts. When I opened the door, Chris was standing there. I froze, staring at him like he was a ghost. He looked like hell. His hair a mess, dark circles under his eyes, like he hadn't slept in days. "Jason," he said quietly. I didn't say a word. I just stood there, gripping the edge of the door. "Can I come in? Why would I let you in?" I snapped, my voice cold. "You think I want to see you right now?" Chris sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I know I don't deserve it, but I need to talk to you. Please." I hesitated, my fists clenching at my sides. Every part of me wanted to slam the door in his face. But at the same time, I wanted answers. I wanted to know why. Finally, I stepped back, letting him in. Chris walked into the cabin and sat on the couch like it was familiar. I stood across from him, arms crossed, refusing to sit down. "Say what you have to say," I said flatly. Chris looked down at his hands, his shoulders slumping. For the first time, he didn't look like the cocky, golden boy I'd grown up with. He looked broken. "I messed up," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how else to say it. I messed up, Jason. I hurt you, and I hate myself for it." "Why?" I demanded, my voice cracking. "Why her, Chris? Why Sarah?" He looked up at me, guilt written all over his face. "I don't know, man. I don't have a good answer for you. I was selfish. I wasn't thinking. It just happened." "It just happened?" I barked, my anger flaring. "You don't just accidentally sleep with your brother's wife, Chris." "I know," he shouted, his voice breaking. "I know, okay? You think I don't hate myself for it? You think I don't wake up every day wishing I could take it back?" His words hung in the air like poison. I stared at him, breathing hard, my chest aching. "You can't take it back," I said quietly. "You destroyed everything. You destroyed us." Chris's shoulders slumped again, and he nodded. "I know. I don't expect you to forgive me. I wanted you to know that I'm sorry. For what it's worth." I didn't respond. What could I say? Sorry didn't fix this. It didn't fix anything. After a moment, Chris stood up, shoving his hands in his pockets. "I'll leave you alone," he said quietly. "But I meant what I said, Jason. I'm sorry." He turned and walked out the door, leaving me standing there in silence. The next day, I got a text from Sarah. "Sarah, can we meet? Please, I need to explain." I stared at the message for a long time before replying. "Me, fine. The coffee shop at 3. When I walked into the coffee shop later that day, Sarah was already there, sitting at a corner table. She looked different, smaller somehow, like the weight of what she'd done was finally catching up to her. I sat down across from her without saying a word. "Jason," she said softly, "thank you for coming." "Get to the point," I said, my voice cold. Sarah took a shaky breath, tears pooling in her eyes. "I'm not going to make excuses. I screwed up. I betrayed you, and I hate myself for it." "Why?" I asked the same question I'd asked Chris. "Why him?" She wiped at her tears, her voice trembling. "I don't know. Things between us felt off. I felt invisible, like you didn't see me anymore. And then Chris was there, and he made me feel wanted." I stared at her, my anger bubbling to the surface. "So your solution was to sleep with my brother? To destroy everything?" "I didn't mean for it to happen," she whispered. I laughed bitterly. "Of course you didn't." Sarah reached across the table, her voice desperate. I still love you, Jason. I want to fix this. Please. I pulled my hand back, shaking my head. You don't get to say that. You don't get to love me and betray me in the same breath. She broke down sobbing, but I didn't care. I stood up, looking down at her one last time. This is done, Sarah, I said quietly. We're done. Then I turned and walked out, leaving her behind. It took months to pick up the pieces of my life. The divorce went through quietly. Chris and I stopped speaking completely. My parents were devastated, but they respected my decision to cut him out of my life. As for me, I started over. I moved to a new city, got a new job, and spent time rebuilding myself from the ground up. It wasn't easy, but slowly, the weight of their betrayal lifted. One day, months later, I got a message from Melissa. Melissa, I hope you're doing okay. Just wanted you to know I left Chris too. Thanks for telling me the truth. I smiled faintly, typing back, me, good for you. Here's to better days ahead. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like maybe, just maybe, I could finally move on. Thank you for going through this with me. Subscribe so you don't miss out on more interesting stories.